If someone had told Daniel Reyes 5 years ago that he would one day sit across a table from the man who killed his wife and offer him his hand in forgiveness, he would have laughed in their face, and then probably walked away in disgust. But grief has a strange way of rearranging a person from the inside out, and by the time this story reaches its end, you'll understand exactly how a man who lost everything found his way back to himself. Before we go further, if stories about real human resilience and the quiet, complicated work of forgiveness move you the way they move me, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because there are so many more stories like this one waiting for you. Now let's go back to where it all began. Daniel Reyes was 33 years old when his life split cleanly into two halves, before and after. Before, he was an ordinary man living an ordinary good life in a small town called Fairhaven. He worked as a mechanical inspector for the county, spent his weekends fixing up an old truck in the garage, and came home every evening to his wife, Elena, and their 4-year-old daughter, Sophie. Elena was a school teacher, the kind who stayed late grading papers and still had energy left over to build blanket forts in the living room. Their life wasn't extraordinary by any outside measure. A modest 3-bedroom house, a mortgage, a minivan with a dent in the back bumper. But it was, in every way that mattered, enough. Daniel used to joke that he'd won the lottery the day Elena agreed to marry him, and he meant it every time he said it. The after began on a Tuesday evening in October, on a stretch of road just outside of town where the streetlights were too far apart and the curve came up faster than most people expected. Elena was driving home from a parent-teacher conference, Sophie strapped into her booster seat in the back, singing along to a cartoon soundtrack playing softly on the radio. A man named Marcus Whitfield was driving in the opposite direction, weaving slightly, a half-empty bottle rolling on the passenger floor of his truck. He crossed the center line by less than 3 feet. That was all it took. Daniel got the call at 7:42 p.m. He remembered the exact time because he glanced at the microwave clock as he reached for the phone, expecting it to be Elena asking if he'd remembered to grab milk on his way home from the hardware store. Instead, it was a stranger's voice, calm in the practiced way of someone trained to deliver terrible news, telling him there had been an accident, that his wife was being taken to Fairhaven General, and that he needed to come immediately. Elena did not survive the night. Sophie, miraculously, walked away with only a broken arm and a concussion. Injuries that would heal in weeks, though the fear in her eyes at the sound of screeching tires would linger for years. Daniel spent that first night in a hospital hallway, one hand pressed against the cool tile wall, trying to remember how to breathe, while a nurse held his daughter in the next room so he could have 5 minutes alone to fall apart before he had to be strong for her. The investigation was swift. Marcus Whitfield's blood alcohol level had been more than twice the legal limit. He had 2 prior DUI convictions, though never one involving an injury this severe. He was 39 years old, divorced, estranged from a grown son, and had been drinking that night after losing his job at a warehouse 3 towns over. None of that mattered to Daniel. All that mattered was that his wife was gone, his daughter had nightmares about car horns, and the man responsible was, in Daniel's mind, a monster who deserved every ounce of suffering the justice system could deliver. At the sentencing hearing, Daniel stood up and read a victim impact statement that took him 3 weeks to write, and that he could barely get through without his voice breaking. He described Elena's laugh, the way she hummed while cooking, the unfinished quilt she'd been sewing for Sophie's bed that now sat folded in the closet because he couldn't bring himself to touch it. He looked directly at Marcus Whitfield as he spoke, searching for some flicker of remorse, and told the courtroom that no sentence would ever be long enough. Marcus received 8 years for vehicular manslaughter while intoxicated. Daniel walked out of that courtroom feeling like justice had been served, and also feeling, for reasons he couldn't yet name, entirely hollow. The years that followed were the hardest of Daniel's life, and not simply because of the grief, though the grief was a constant, gray weight that never fully lifted. It was the logistics of loss that nearly broke him, learning how to braid Sophie's hair before school, discovering he had no idea what size shoes she wore, sitting up at 2 a.m. because she'd had another nightmare and only Elena had ever known the right words to say to calm her down. He took a leave of absence from work that turned into a demotion when he returned, because he could no longer manage the travel the job required. Money got tight. Friends who had once filled his weekends slowly drifted away, unsure how to be around a grief that didn't seem to have an expiration date. Daniel became a single father in the truest and hardest sense of the word, not just raising a child alone, but doing it while carrying a wound that never fully scarred over. He built a routine that worked, eventually. Mornings were oatmeal and mismatched socks, and Sophie chattering about her stuffed rabbit. Evenings were homework at the kitchen table, and Daniel teaching himself, slowly and clumsily, how to braid hair from online videos, while Sophie giggled at his frustration. He didn't date. He didn't really let himself feel much of anything beyond what was necessary to function and to parent. Underneath all of it, quietly, was Marcus Whitfield, a name Daniel refused to say out loud, a presence that lived in the back of his mind like a low hum of static he'd learned to tune out most days, except for the anniversary of the crash, when the static became a scream. Sophie grew. She was 9 now, sharp and curious, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin. She didn't remember much about the accident itself, but she remembered enough, the sound mostly, and sometimes she still flinched at sudden braking. She asked about her mother often, and Daniel told a bad joke. He never told Sophie he hated the man who took her mother from them. He didn't have to. Some things a child absorbs from the air around them. It was in the 5th year, on an unremarkable Thursday afternoon, that a letter arrived that would set everything back into motion. It came from the Department of Corrections, a standard notification that Daniel, as the surviving spouse and registered victim contact, was legally entitled to receive. Marcus Whitfield was being released early on good behavior after serving 5 years of his 8-year sentence, and would be residing at a supervised halfway house, 2 counties over, as part of his transition back into society. Daniel read the letter 3 times, standing at the kitchen counter, and each time the words seemed to rearrange themselves into something more unbearable. 5 years. 5 years for Elena's entire life, for the mother Sophie would never fully know, for the future that had been erased in a stretch of road that took less than 4 seconds to change everything. He felt something crack open in his chest, old anger, sharpened rather than dulled by time, rising up with a force that frightened him. He sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of him until the sun came up, turning over every version of fury he'd suppressed for half a decade. He thought about writing to the parole board to object, though he knew the decision was likely already final. He thought about driving to the halfway house and saying everything he never got to say in that courtroom, unfiltered by legal decorum. He thought, in his darkest hour around 3 a.m., about things he wasn't proud of thinking. And somewhere in the gray hours before dawn, exhausted past the point of anger, another thought arrived, quieter and more unwelcome than the rest. What if none of this rage was actually protecting him from anything? What if he'd simply been carrying a weight for 5 years that had done nothing but make him tired? He didn't act on anything right away. Life continued. School drop-offs, a promotion he'd finally earned back at work, Sophie's first piano recital, where she looked out into the audience for her mother out of habit before her eyes found Daniel instead, and she smiled anyway. But the letter sat in a drawer, and its presence changed something in the air of the house, like a held breath neither of them could name. 3 months later, Daniel found himself, almost without deciding to, driving toward the halfway house on a Saturday afternoon while Sophie was at a friend's birthday party. He told himself he was just going to look at the building, to see the place, to satisfy some morbid curiosity, and then drive home and never think about it again. But when he pulled into the gravel lot and saw a thin, gray-haired man sitting alone on a bench outside, wearing an ill-fitting jacket and staring at nothing in particular, Daniel recognized him instantly, even 5 years and what looked like 20 pounds thinner. He sat in his car for 11 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, before he got out. Marcus looked up when Daniel's shadow fell across him, and something in his face shifted. Recognition, then fear, then a kind of resigned stillness, as though he'd been waiting for this exact moment since the day he walked out of prison. Maybe since the night of the crash itself. He didn't run. He didn't offer excuses. He simply sat there, visibly bracing for whatever was about to happen. "I don't know why I'm here," Daniel said, and it was the truest thing he'd said in 5 years. They ended up inside, in a small visiting room with metal folding chairs and a table bolted to the floor, because Marcus asked, quietly, if Daniel would sit down instead of standing over him. And Daniel, to his own surprise, agreed. What followed was not the confrontation Daniel had imagined in 100 sleepless variations. Marcus didn't defend himself. He didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't perform remorse for an audience. He simply told the truth, haltingly, about the man he'd been that night. A man drowning in his own failures, using alcohol to numb a life he felt he'd ruined long before he ever got behind that wheel. He said he thought about Elena every day. He said he knew an apology meant nothing, that nothing he could say would undo what he'd taken. He said he understood if Daniel hated him, that he hated himself plenty for both of them. Daniel sat there for a long time without speaking, feeling old anger rise and, strangely, not finding solid ground to stand on. It's hard to hate a monster when the man in front of you is just a broken person, aged and diminished, carrying his own version of the wreckage. That didn't erase what he'd done. It didn't make Elena's absence hurt any less. but it made the shape of Daniel's anger harder to hold on to, like trying to grip smoke. He left that day without forgiving Marcus. He wanted to be clear with himself about that, driving home with his hands shaking on the wheel, unsure what had just happened or why he'd let it happen at all. But something had shifted. Some door that had been sealed shut for 5 years now stood slightly ajar, and Daniel found he couldn't quite close it again. He went back 3 more times over the following 2 months, each visit shorter than the last argument he'd rehearsed in his head on the drive over. Marcus told him about the son he'd lost contact with years before the accident, about the meetings he now attended every week, about the letters he'd written to Daniel and never sent because he didn't believe he had the right to intrude on Daniel's grief. Daniel, in turn, found himself talking about Elena. Not the accident, but her, the parts of her that lived on in Sophie, the parts he was terrified of forgetting. It was strange talking about his wife to the one man who had ended her life, but it was also, in some way he couldn't fully articulate, healing. Marcus never flinched from those conversations. He listened like a man doing penance, which, Daniel supposed, he was. On his 4th visit, Daniel brought a photograph, not to hurt Marcus, but because he found, unexpectedly, that he wanted Marcus to see her, to understand fully what had been lost, not as an abstraction, but as a real, specific, laughing woman. Marcus held the photo with both hands, and Daniel watched a man who had spent 5 years in prison, who had built walls around whatever remorse he carried, come apart quietly at a kitchen table photograph of a woman he'd never truly known, but had changed forever. It was on that visit that Daniel finally said the words he hadn't planned to say. He told Marcus he forgave him. Not because Marcus deserved it. Daniel was honest about that, painfully honest. But because he, Daniel, deserved to put the weight down. He said he was tired of being angry, tired of teaching his daughter to hold on to hatred by example, tired of a rage that had done nothing in 5 years except keep him from fully living the life Elena would have wanted for him in Sophie. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't a gift he was giving to Marcus. It was one he was finally giving to himself. Marcus wept, openly, the way men who have spent years being told not to cry sometimes finally do when given permission by someone they never expected mercy from. He reached across the table, hesitant, unsure if the gesture would be welcome, and Daniel, after a long moment, took his hand. It didn't fix everything. Elena was still gone. Sophie would still grow up without her mother's voice at bedtime, without her laugh at recitals, without the 1,000 small moments a parent is owed and never gets back. Daniel didn't invite Marcus to holidays or pretend a friendship had bloomed from tragedy. Some things, he understood, cannot and should not be undone or smoothed over. But something in Daniel had changed permanently that day, a loosening, a lightness he hadn't felt in 5 years, as if he'd finally set down a stone he didn't realize he'd been carrying in his chest since October. He told Sophie about it eventually, in simple terms suited to a 9-year-old's understanding, that the man who caused the accident that hurt her and took her mother had gotten out of prison, that Daniel had gone to see him, and that he had decided to forgive him, not because what happened was okay, but because carrying so much anger was making it hard for Daniel to be the father she deserved. Sophie listened with the solemn seriousness only children can manage, and then asked if that meant Daniel wasn't sad anymore. Daniel told her he would probably always be a little sad, that missing her mother wasn't something that ever fully went away, but that he felt lighter now, like he could breathe a little easier. Sophie nodded, seemingly satisfied, and asked if they could get ice cream, and Daniel found himself laughing. A real laugh, the first in longer than he could remember, because that was exactly the kind of thing Elena would have said too. Marcus completed his transitional program 8 months later and moved to a small apartment across town, taking a job at a hardware store and attending meetings twice a week. He and Daniel didn't become friends in any conventional sense, but they exchanged occasional messages, mostly around difficult anniversaries. 2 men bound together forever by a tragedy neither of them had chosen but had both, in their own ways, had to learn to carry. 2 years after that first visit to the halfway house, Daniel stood at the edge of a small lake outside Fairhaven, watching Sophie, now 11, skip stones across the water with the same stubborn determination her mother used to bring to everything she did. He thought about how strange the shape of a life can be, how the same road that took everything from him had, in some circuitous and painful way, also taught him the one lesson he suspected Elena would have wanted him to learn most, that holding on to hatred doesn't protect the people we love. It only steals more time from them. Forgiveness, Daniel had come to understand, was never really about the man who wronged him. It was about a single father deciding, deliberately and against every instinct telling him otherwise, to stop letting a single terrible night define the rest of his life and his daughter's. It didn't erase the past. It simply made room for something else to grow alongside the grief. Patience, lightness, the ability to laugh again without guilt, the ability to teach his daughter that even the deepest wounds don't have to calcify into permanent bitterness. If there is one thing this story leaves behind, it is this: forgiveness is rarely a single moment of grand cinematic release. It is a slow, deliberate, often exhausting choice, made again and again, long after the courtroom is emptied and the headlines have faded, by ordinary people simply trying to find a way to keep living without being crushed by what they cannot change. Daniel Reyes didn't forgive Marcus Whitfield because it was easy, or because Marcus earned it, or because grief simply evaporated with time. He forgave him because he refused to let one man's worst night keep stealing from his and his daughter's best days. And in the end, that choice, quiet, unglamorous, and entirely his own, gave him back the one thing he thought he'd lost forever alongside his wife: the ability to feel, fully and without apology, like himself again.